advisors here at the Scholarship Foundation of St. Louis. And I want to thank you so much for joining our first in our FAFSA Friday series. So today we are going to get started with all things FSA ID. So it's just a couple housekeeping things. I'll ask that if you have questions as the presentation goes on, that you drop those in the chat, but we will have time for some Q&A at the end as well. And additionally, we are recording this session, so we'll be able to send it out via email a little bit later, along with some additional materials. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. And fingers crossed. Did my slide change? Did everyone see that? Look good? Okay, cool. I was fighting with Zoom earlier, so I'm glad that that's working now. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda, some of the things that we're going to cover today. So we'll start with the basics of what is an FSA ID. This may be a refresher for some folks, but I just want to make sure we're all kind of starting from the same place with the same information. Then we'll talk a little bit about who needs an FSA ID, how to create an FSA ID, and then some things to keep in mind, both for students and families navigating this process, as well as for us as college access professionals, as folks are navigating this process. So let's start first with what is an FSA ID. So an FSA ID, or a Federal Student Aid ID, is going to be the username and password that's associated with someone's Federal Student Aid account. So something that is a little bit new this year and that we're going to dive a little deeper into is that all contributors on a FAFSA must have a verified FSA ID. And so this means that anyone who is contributing information to a FAFSA as of the 24-25 FAFSA year must have this verified account set up with Federal Student Aid. Each user, so anyone who is accessing this Federal Student Aid website, can only have one account. So that means if you are working with students or perhaps parents, contributors who have used the website before, who have filled out a FAFSA for perhaps an older child, as a parent, maybe they have gone through the FAFSA process themselves. They will need to use the same information to support their students' FAFSA. So for some folks, that might mean going through the retrieval process for their password or username if they've forgotten it, but everybody only gets one account in their lifetime. So that may be something you have to help folks navigate, is retrieving that information if they've set up an FSA ID before. The reason you can only have one Federal Student Aid account, or FSA ID, is because the FSA ID is tied to, for most people, your Social Security number and verified by the Social Security Administration, which is why you can only have that one account. The FSA ID serves as a legally binding signature for a whole host of Federal Student Aid related items. And so that's why it's really important that everyone, when they are setting up their FSA ID, is using the correct information and completing the process in the correct way, so that way their FSA ID may serve as that legally binding signature. So who needs an FSA ID? As I alluded to a little bit earlier, this is where we are seeing some changes for this upcoming FAFSA cycle. So for the 24-25 FAFSA and moving forward, all contributors will need to have a verified FSA ID to complete and submit a FAFSA. So depending on a family situation, this will mean the student certainly will need an FSA ID. It could include one or both parents, a step parent, if the student is married, their spouse. Anyone whose information is going onto the FAFSA will need to have a verified FSA ID. Now, we won't get too deep into contributors today, figuring out whose information needs to go on the FAFSA, but shameless plug for our next presentation in our FAFSA Friday series on October 6th. That will be all about contributors. So I highly recommend you add that to your calendar as well if you don't already have that on there. But the big change and one of the big things that is coming with this FAFSA simplification updates is that because all contributors need to have this verified FSA ID, that includes folks without a Social Security number. So that is a change from past years. Before, if you did not have a social security number, you were not able to set up an FSA ID, and the process for students with parents or a spouse who did not have a social security number would be to complete the FAFSA online, print out that physical signature page, and have that contributor sign and mail it into federal student aid. That is no longer going to be an option. So anyone whose information is going onto a FAFSA must have an account and an FSA ID set up. So an important note here is that in order to be eligible for federal student aid, you still must have a social security number or be a qualified non-citizen. So this doesn't change for students. Students will still need to have that social security number to be eligible for the federal aid. But this is just for contributors, so parents or step-parents, spouses. So federal student aid has announced kind of what the process will be for these folks who don't have a social security number to use to set up their FSA ID. They will go through a knowledge check through TransUnion. This knowledge check is going to use some publicly available data and records to confirm their identity. And so this is a process that's used in other places online. You may have gone through this yourself. They'll ask questions like, which of these addresses have you not lived at in the past 10 years? And it'll give a whole list of addresses you may have lived at, and you need to find the ones that are not applicable, those kinds of things. So there will be a series of questions that folks can use to verify their identity. So while federal student aid has announced this process and shared that this is going to be what the process will look like, as of an update webinar that they put out earlier this week, they said that they're still finalizing this process and it hasn't been rolled out yet. So anyone who does not have a social security number is not yet able to go in and start working on this FSA ID process, but they have shared that it will be available before the FAFSA opens in December. So I would say that this is an important thing to kind of be keeping an eye on and looking for updates from federal student aid because we aren't sure exactly what this is going to look like in practice quite yet. On the other hand, students, contributors who do have social security numbers can begin setting up their FSA IDs today. The website is open and they can get in there and start working on this process now. And in fact, our recommendation would be that students and families should be starting this process as soon as possible. The Social Security Administration has said that their verification process will take 3 to 5 days. And an important thing to know is, in the past, a student could create their FSA ID and start filling out the FAFSA in the same day. A change this year is that all FSA IDs will need to be verified before they can work on their FAFSA. So families will need to have this process done before they can even start working on that on the application. So it will be important for folks to complete this process at least a week in advance of whenever they plan to start the FAFSA, but certainly earlier if possible. And I think this fall will prove to be a good time to be supporting students and families through this process so they're ready when the FAFSA becomes available later this year. Let's see here. So now let's dive a little bit more into what the actual process of creating an FSA ID looks like. So this is the landing page that students, contributors see when they first get onto Federal Student Aid's website and click Create an Account. So you'll see it does give kind of a broad overview of why you might need a Federal Student Aid account, what you can do with your account. And it gives a little bit of information about what folks will need to set up their FSA ID. So I just wanted to give a visual of what you see when you first hop on the website and click that Create an Account option. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of really setting up an FSA ID and what it entails. The first thing that folks will be asked to enter is their name, birthday, and social security number. It's really important to note that all of this information has to be input exactly as it appears on the social security card. So it's really helpful even for people who have their social security number memorized to have either the card with them, a picture of their Social Security card, so they can ensure that they are entering things exactly as it appears. You know, it's not uncommon for example, a student maybe goes by a nickname or a middle name, has always used something other than their legal first name. They may, you know, inadvertently enter that as they're trying to create their FSA ID because that's the name they go by. And that can create a lot of issues because it won't be able to be verified by the Social Security Administration. So just ensuring everyone knows that what they're entering into that FSA ID creation page needs to be exactly what's on their Social Security number. Again, starting with this new FAFSA cycle, every FSA ID that is created is required to have a verifiable email address associated with it. And folks also have the option to add a cell phone number, which we highly recommend if you have a cell phone number available, adding it to the account as well. So there's a couple different ways that this contact information is used. So it's used in the case that, you know, a password username is forgotten. You can go through the process to retrieve those things using your email or phone number, verified email or phone number, I should say. But also moving forward, all users are going to be required to use two-factor authentication when logging into the Federal Student Aid website. And so that's where you put in your username and password, and the first screen it gives you is we have to send you a code to verify before we can log you in. Do you want it via email, text message, whatever? That's the process that everyone is going to have to go through every time they log into the Federal Student Aid website. So having both an email and phone number on file just gives you more options to kind of navigate that two-factor authentication process. It's important to note that email addresses and phone numbers can only be associated with one FSA ID account. So it won't be possible for, let's say, a parent to set up their account as well as their student's account, both under the parent's email and phone number. Everyone will need to have their own unique contact information tied to their accounts. The other option for two-factor authentication is going to be using an authentication app. I will be very honest to say that that is not an option that I've seen people use very frequently to date. I think it's much more common to use that email address or getting a code texted to your phone, but that is an option for people who prefer to use those authentication apps. Some more related to setting up the FSA ID. So when users get to the point where they're setting up their passwords, that password cannot contain any piece of the user's name, date of birth, or Social Security number. The Federal Student Aid website has pretty stringent requirements for the passwords and what they expect to be in there and not be in there. I will say, as people are on that page, it kind of shows you all of the required pieces of the password as you're setting it up. So it does give you an idea of what you need to include or not include in the password, but they have some pretty strict guidelines. So this password piece can take folks a little bit of time because sometimes it's thinking up a new password that they've never used anywhere else, or having to include a lot of things they aren't used to including in a password. The other thing that they'll have to set up are challenge questions. And so these are kind of a backup option when the two-factor authentication methods can't be used to gain access to an account, reset a password, those kinds of things. So the way that users are setting up their challenge questions, they're given a drop-down menu of pre-populated questions that they can select from, and then they are manually entering their answers to the challenge questions. So it is absolutely crucial when folks are doing this that they're hitting the little icon that allows you to see what you've typed in, because, you know, anytime you're manually entering information, it opens up the opportunity for errors. And so making sure people have spelled things correctly, put the right answer in the right box that matches with the question, all those kinds of things are going to be an important process. So just ensuring that everyone double checks their work when they're putting in their responses for the challenge questions is important. And then once you have created your FSA ID, all users receive a one-time backup code. This, again, is kind of a backup feature if you don't have access to those two-factor authentication methods that you've put in if you're having trouble gaining access to your account. This is a one-time code, so it will give you a screen that shows the code. Recommend people take a picture of it to save on their phone, write it down somewhere, because it is a one-time use code and they will need to save it somewhere in the instance that they need to use it to get back into their account. Once a user is logged in, however, they can generate themselves a new backup code. So let's say a family set up an FSA ID, a couple weeks ago, forgot to write that piece down or keep track of it. As long as you're logged into your account, you can generate a new code for use in the future, but you have to be logged in to do that. So of course, if you're at the point where someone is not able to access their account and doesn't have their backup code written down somewhere or saved somewhere, it won't be super useful, but there is the option to generate a new one once if you are successfully already logged into your account. So finally, recommend that students and families write all of this information down somewhere. So username, password, email, and phone numbers that are associated with the accounts, all the challenge questions and their answers, the backup code, everything should be stored somewhere safely. So whether that is physically written down and kept wherever everyone else keeps their important paper documents at home, perhaps saved on a phone, maybe both places, whatever works best for people. But this is information that you are going to need for likely multiple years in a row. And so it's just important to have everything saved in a safe spot. The Scholarship Foundation, we do have kind of a little one-page document that has a lot of information about the FSA ID, as well as a space to write down all of your answers. And so we can share that if you are interested in sharing that with students or families. That can be a good option of just a good, one spot to keep everything. But whatever works best with the students, families, population that you're working with to keep all that information safe. All right, so some things to keep in mind, both for, like I said, students and families, but also for us as professionals, as we are helping people navigate this process and perhaps guiding them through. So something that might be new this year, something that might come up more often, is helping families and students create email addresses. So I mentioned before that the bare minimum requirement is going to be that every account is associated with an email address. And it's not uncommon for folks to not have an email address or not use email regularly. So that may be a piece of FSA ID creation that you should anticipate. We may need to work on ensuring that everybody who needs an FSA ID has an email address they can access before we even get to the point of setting up an FSA ID. And so this includes, again, contributors like parents, but also students. Many students have school email addresses that they will lose access to after graduation. So depending on your district, some students lose it immediately. Sometimes their school email address sticks around for a year, it depends, but they will need access to this, to their FSA ID and their federal student aid account, likely beyond that. So whether the student has a personal email address already or needs to set one up, encourage students to use that personal email address so they have continued access to the address tied to their federal student aid account. I think we should anticipate additional time spent assisting with FSA ID creation and troubleshooting. Again, there's so many changes coming to the FAFSA process and federal student aid this year that we know that they are working very, very diligently to take care of all of these things, but I think we should anticipate that there may be some technology challenges and barriers once this becomes available to everybody. And also just thinking that now everybody needs to have an FSA ID is inherently probably going to be a bit more work. So in the example of a student who perhaps has a single parent, but their single parent doesn't have a social security number, in the past, their process would have been the student sets up an FSA ID, completes their FAFSA, prints out the page, has their parents sign it, we mail it in. Now that process is going to be not only setting up the student with an FSA ID, but also that parent with an FSA ID. And so inherently there, we have now doubled the amount of work that we need to do to prepare a student to fill out the FAFSA. So I suppose if we want to find a silver lining to the FAFSA's delayed opening this year, it's that it gives us a lot of time this fall to ensure that students and families have this FSA ID process taken care of, so they can really hit the ground running once December rolls around, December whatever, since we still don't know the official date, and the FAFSA opens. I think we also will need to be mindful of and have a sensitivity to concerns from parents and contributors who don't have Social Security numbers. So if you're working with a family that this is their first time filing the FAFSA, they won't have any idea of what the process used to be like. But for families who, for example, have older children who have already gone through the process, they may remember that they weren't allowed to have an FSA ID before, and that they had that signature page that they needed to sign and mail in. And so this will be a noticeable change for them. So I think that we just need to be sensitive to perhaps some hesitancy or concerns on the parts of these families who maybe will wonder, why has this changed and what does this mean for us? And so there may be a little bit more time spent around education and ensuring they understand why this change has happened and why it's necessary now to set up an FSA ID. And then finally, I just wanted to reiterate that the FSA IDs will need to be verified before folks can go in and start working on the FAFSA, and that they are saying that will take 3 to 5 days. Again, with all of these changes, with some technology issues that we may not even be anticipating already, I think it will be a good practice to encourage people just do this as soon as possible, to ensure that you're ready to go when the FAFSA opens. Again, at minimum, I would say a week ahead of time, but if we can start working on these now, so you are absolutely good to go before December, that would be even better. So finally, a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. These are the upcoming workshops that we have planned here at the Scholarship Foundation. We have a variety of workshops through this 23-24 academic year, as well as some clinics. So one that is especially relevant to our conversation today is our FSA ID creation and problem solving clinic on October 28th. So that's a Saturday, 10 to 12. We ask that folks do make an appointment if they plan on coming. So they're welcome to call our office and just let us know that they're planning on stopping by. And this will be an opportunity for families and students to get that one-on-one attention and kind of guidance through this FSA ID creation process. As always, advising services, workshops, clinics from the Scholarship Foundation are at no cost to students or families. So this is free of charge. They're welcome to just come by and get assistance, whatever kind of assistance they might need. And we can share this information with you all again once we send out the recording of this presentation, and you are welcome to distribute it and share it with families and the people you serve. And then last, I wanted to make sure that you all have our contact information. So while we are preparing to help students and families through this process, we also want to be a resource for our peers and our colleagues who are working with students and families. With all of these FAFSA changes coming, I think that we all will have to work together to navigate these new situations and new policies. And so if you have any questions that come up while you're working with students or families, please feel free to reach out to us, and we would be happy to provide support and guidance, and keep in touch and let us know, I guess, what you are hearing with these FAFSA changes. And if there's things that you're learning that would be important for us to know, we love to share information and be able to best serve the populations we work with. So thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to a little bit more about FSA IDs. I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat, so I don't know if we've had questions coming in there, but if you want to unmute and ask questions at this point too, you are welcome to do that.
There haven't been any questions in the chat yet, Grace. But we would be happy to share the PowerPoint, yes.
A student who, her older brother I had a couple of years ago, and I remember that he said he never was able to successfully complete an FSA ID for something, something was just awry. I think he was somebody who had dealt with identity theft, and there was just a big issue with his FSA ID. So he always completed a signature page. And when I met with her, I was like, hey, I know your dad did this for your brother. It's not going to be a thing for you. Do you know if there's any guidance on parents like that who, like, it's for like technological failures or things like that? Like if there'll be any fix for them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Teresa, I might kick that one over to you because I can't remember if we've heard much about what that process, especially for folks with identity theft, is going to look like.
Yeah, so I haven't heard anything specific. One of the things, and Caitlin, I'll tap you just in case you've heard anything else. So when some of us were in DC this summer for a FAFSA training with federal student aid, and on the topic of individuals who do not have a social security number creating a federal student aid ID, the Department of Education will have some kind of identity proofing process that's very vague, and I don't know exactly what that will ultimately entail, but it sounds like there will be a sort of secondary option for individuals without a social security number. So I'm unclear if that secondary option may ultimately be available to some individuals who cannot get the Social Security Administration to verify their identity, but that remains to be seen. I don't have specific details on that. And Caitlin, I don't know if you've heard anything else on that topic or if you heard something different when we were in DC.
No, that's
Okay.
what I remember as well. And every day, I just wait for announcements from federal student aid. And every day it goes by with no announcement.
Yeah.
So hopefully they're coming soon.
Yeah, there's been a lot of like specific questions I've asked at, like, I go to as many of these as I can because I'm just hungry for information. I'm always like, hi, I have this very specific question. And they're like, I don't know, nobody's addressed it yet. I'm like, cool, thanks. Yeah.
Well, we will certainly keep you all posted if we learn or hear anything more about the FSA IDs for those individuals who are going to struggle with having their identity verified by the Social Security Administration, or what that secondary process will look like for individuals who do not have a Social Security number.
Thanks, Teresa. Are there any other questions at this time? I don't think so. Okay, if there's nothing else, we will be sure to send out a follow-up email with some of the materials we mentioned. We also are in the process of updating all of our workbooks to reflect all of these FAFSA changes and updates to federal student aid. So we will also be able to share those. We're hoping to have those posted on our website very shortly. So we will be sure to send out some of that information as well. So thank you all so much for your time. If you do have questions and want to stick around, feel free. We can hang out for a little bit. But for anyone else, happy Friday. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.